I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I'd like to thank Dr. Tomasian for putting this on. This is really a great benefit to the community. And as Tomas said, I come from an old New Mexico family. On my mother's side, I trace it back to the Oñate colony in 1598.
Hold on.
This family has been here ever since.
We have a microphone. Hold on.
That's a good idea.
Is it?
Yeah, it's, yeah.
Sorry about that.
Hold on.
The advantage, of course, speaking.
A new place and I'm already not organized. How I'm German of me.
Now the one,
Oops, this fell off. Does that sound good?
that's good, excellent.
Then we'll put this. Want to start talking?
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
How about those in the back?
I don't think it's the mic is working. Try it now.
Is it working?
No, but you are speaking louder.
You should be Santa Claus next time. No. But it works. I just have to.
It's too far away
It's
from his
not from
mouth.
that far away. It's not close to his mouth.
How's that?
Clip it to his beard.
How about? Yeah. Now,
How's that sound? Can you hear me now?
is that better?
A little
That's
bit.
why that commercial.
Can you hear me now? Can you hold it or?
I'll try to hold it, sure.
Yeah.
That might make it worse though.
I don't know. This way it sounds okay.
That's right.
Yeah, now that.
Just needs to be close.
Well, let's get started.
Yeah, you do that.
If you can't hear me in the back, just wave your hand and I'll move this thing a little closer. Made of mud, wood, rock, and straw, La Casa de Don Antonio Severino Martinez was the finest house or rancho in the New Spanish frontier. Around 1800, Severino, a descendant of the Martin Serrano sheep ranching family, moved his wife, Carmel Santisteban, and 6 children from Abiquiu to Ranchitos de Taos, several miles west of the Taos Plaza. Severino and Carmel were the parents of the famous priest Antonio Jose Martinez. At this time, wool products such as clothes and blankets from the frontier were recognized as superior and held great market value. The best wool came from El Norte, where the extreme cold forced the sheep to put on thick winter coats. Business was booming, and many businesses formed around the sheep ranching business, such as preparing the wool and weaving it into something that everybody could use. The new frontier, now New Mexico, was a wealthy place, and Los Martin Serranos had the resources to build this masterpiece. With great community participation, the rancho was built over a period of 2 years. The first year was used to gather materials at the building site and digging and building a rock foundation. The next year, thousands of adobes were made from the same material that was used to build Taos Pueblo. The design of the house is typical of dwellings from the mountains of Spain, with massive adobe walls, 1 vara thick, and a ceiling and a roof that was 2 varas thick. The primary function of this house was to conserve heat and maximize the exposure to the sun. A vara, by the way, is 33.3 inches long, and I'll show you what a vara means. This is a vara. A house was 2 varas wide, teeny tiny rooms, but the key was to save heat. After the Pueblo revolt of, can we go to the next one? Yeah. After the Pueblo revolt of 1680, people here accepted a more peaceful and pragmatic approach to business. Everyone could participate in the business of wool and be fairly paid for their product and services. By 1740, peace was celebrated in El Norte. The Taos Valley also had a vibrant and eager labor pool. Now, I want to show you on this, relating back to the old photograph, the first one, That is the front entrance there. It measured 8 vadas and it faced the river. This back area here was a privy that went to corrals, perhaps gardens, privy, so on. The rooms from the very beginning here begin with Don Severino's room. It was an office. You can see where he had glass, he had a window and 2 doors, and that room interconnected to the capilla, for what was their family chapel. It's not counted in my guide as a room. Some people in Taos seem to think that the capilla would not have been included in Don Severino's will, and that's why, I haven't included it. But anyway, if you look around following the guide that I've handed out, you can see that these rooms were teeny tiny. Most of them being used to conserve heat and maximize the sunlight. Going to a room like number 6 here, which was extremely cold, probably used for aging and drying meat. Back to a room here like number 14, which had 2 windows. It was positioned excellently to collect sunlight. And then all the other rooms, the important rooms were those that had the most exposure to the sun. Those that had less exposure were used for either storage, or cooking, preparing food, and so on. And that's how this house was put together. Okay, the rancho could be entered through the south-facing opening of 8 waters, like I pointed out. The placito hardly had anything in it, perhaps a hitching rail. No well, no thrills. Water was carried from the river to the house in boards. And if we can go back to the first photograph, I'd like to point out, you see, here's a board right here that was used to bring water to the house. When they leave, they place the board there, and then they fill it back up. Now, it was, building a well was prohibitive in some of these areas, and the reason was that the water table in Taos, because the water pressure was so high at that time, if you poked a hole in the ground, you'd have water gushing up. And so back here in the back, behind the house, the water table would come up and it would become very swampy and very marshy. One thing also to note is that all of the material for building the house, all of the dirt, the rocks and so on, came from right in here. And it was excellent material. That's how Taos Pueblo, on the same river, built with the same material. Okay. The house was massive, as I've said. Walls were a vada thick, and the ceiling and the roof was 2 vadas thick. In other words, the roof would come up to about right here on me. Okay, anybody else, would probably bang their head, but us short guys, the Spanish were short people. So they didn't have very high ceilings. Adobe bricks were made by hand, not from molds. A worker would take a hunk of wet adobe material, mixed with straw and everything else, and form the adobe by patting it together like this. You see, tapping and patting. Molds weren't used because there was no milled lumber to build the mold. These handmade adobe bricks, after they dried in the sun, many of the old timers told me that they were actually superior, that you could take a handmade adobe and throw it and it would bounce, or sometimes these made from molds would shatter. And there is, some of the old adobe are still exposed at the house. Okay. The bricks were mortared and chinked with the same material. The ceiling was made from vigas cut and peeled log, which were 4 vadas by about 14 inches wide. Latillas cut and peeled sticks were placed across the vadas. Straw was scattered over the latillas, and more than a vada of dirt was tamped over the straw. The ceiling was at least that thick with dirt, tamped down and so on. For the house to last, for it to have longevity, it was important that the ceiling, the roof, be constructed correctly, and that the house be maintained. And that's why it survived. This photograph was made about 1901, and the house had survived for about 100 years. And that's why. They had no canales. The roof, it would snow or rain. Members of the Martinez family would go up to the house, they'd remove the snow right after a big snow, probably not a very fun job. Otherwise, they'd be left to dry on their own. You know, no canales in any of these houses. And also you might note that the lintels and the edges of the vigas were plastered over, and that's what helped preserve the vigas, thus helping preserve the roof. Where they leave the lintels and vigas and all that stuff exposed was not done during the colonial period. Probably more of a fashion statement now. Now, woodwork included adze plank floors, your jambs, your windows, and doors. Instead of hinges, doors were carved with a tenon on the top and the bottom of the door that corresponded with matching mortises of the door jamb. The doors were heavy, they were about that thick, all made from adze planked wood. Latches, not locks, were used to secure the doors. We go to the next, not that one, the next one. Okay, now, to build the house, people from all over the community with different skills came together. Here it shows them using a sled to bring in hay. Of course, the photograph was made about 100 years later, but the technology remained the same. And let's look at the next photograph. Okay, here they're digging Randall's Pond in Taos. There are some 15 teams with dredges, with scoops, with all kinds of equipment used to scoop up and scrape up this earth. Those were usually made from cottonwood. Cottonwood could absorb the shock, whereas other woods were too brittle and would often break. The point is that there was plenty of labor, the technology was there to build such a house in such a short time. Okay, lintels, smaller logs were cut and peeled or planked and supported the weight of the adobe above the windows and the doors. Vigas, as I say, were cut to the exact length, and some of the floors were just compacted dirt. The Severino's office and probably the Capilla had a wood plank floor. A wood plank floor is mentioned in Severino's will. Let's go to the next photograph. Here they're making adobes, and if you have a proper crew, a good crew, you can make a lot of adobes in a day. However, these adobes aren't the Spanish colonial adobes. They've been made with a mold. They're good adobes. Let's go to the next one. And here's a guy making adobes at the end of the day. You know, you let them dry and then he'll stack them. And the next photograph. Okay, this is a torreon, and it's been misunderstood in Spanish colonial history. Torreons were not used for defense, to defend themselves against marauding, raiding Indians. They were used to bring the sheep in at night or when the weather was bad. They were used to protect their livestock. And one thing interesting about this torreon was that it was not a Spanish colonial torreon. You can look at the bricks on the bottom, and they're all even. They've been made from molds. However, this part right here appears to be the ruins of an older torreon, and they've used bricks from the older torreon near the top. You can see some of these bricks aren't uniform right in here. There aren't many torreons left, but anyway, I wanted to clear up a misconception that these were not defensive structures. These were structures that were used to protect their livestock. In 1970, historic preservation of early Spanish buildings became a big deal in New Mexico. Mostly Anglo scholars and pseudo-scholars with little knowledge of Hispano history and culture in New Mexico undertook this challenge. Hispano-Anglo relations at that time were really at a low point. Land grant issues had become very divisive. You had Hispanos on one hand claiming community land grant privileges, and Anglos on the other hand mostly siding with the government and the nullification of those land grants. with mistrust and suspicion, the prevailing attitude from the campus of New Mexico Highlands University was one of indifference. As a member of Highlands, student at Highlands, I had many discussions about these types of issues. Many Hispanos believed their attitudes were at the time to allow these old structures to dissolve and go back into the earth. I come from a unique perspective here. With my blue eyes and fair skin, one might think that I'm not qualified to address this subject, too gringo. I trace my ancestry in New Mexico back to at least 1598 and the Oñate colony in San Gabriel. I too am a descendant of the old Martin Serrano family of El Norte. Can we go to the next photograph, please? This woman here is my great-grandmother, Josefa Valdez, and she was born in Taos in 1842. She was baptized by Padre Martinez. She was educated by Padre Martinez. She's buried next to Padre Martinez in the Kit Carson Cemetery. You know, there's a very close relationship in my family here. Let's look at the next photograph. Okay, in 1860, she married Captain Smith Simpson. And Captain Simpson was Kit Carson's right-hand man. Captain Simpson was also military commander of Taos when Carson was out of town. He was a Union infantry officer. But Captain Simpson and Josefa had 6 children. I am the descendant of their daughter, Estella, who was born in Taos in 1874. Estella, in 1903, married a Taos banker and amateur photographer, B.G. Randall. You may have heard of Randall. I've been working with his photography for quite some time. If we can go to the next photograph, many people recognize this beautiful portrait. This is Josefa. Oh, she passed away in 1907, a little before she passed away. And she was in the wool business. She bought and sold wool. You know, these blankets, these Taos blankets, were very high in demand. You know, they're well-made, warm, and they color them with different dyes and so on. A very marketable item. If we can go to the next photograph, please. Okay, the old Martinez house went through many changes. By the mid-1960s, all kinds of things had happened. The rooms had been widened, portals had been added, they had extended the height of the building, the capilla or chapel had been removed and replaced with a gateway to the placita. The old entrance was walled up and made into an additional room. Right here, for example, you can see where this right here was a window and it was turned into a door. Here we see these logs going across was the old entrance to the hospital, to the house. A door was put into it, it became another room. The window that was here became a door. The window that was here became a door, and the door that was here was walled over. Here, where their capilla was turned into an entranceway. They call it a zaguan now. And here is the door at the end of the house. If you want to go back to the first photograph, I could show you how that works. No, not that one. Backwards.
We'll go back to the first one.
Yeah, the first photograph. Okay. Here's that window that became a door. And incidentally, there are 2 windows over here, one in here and one in here. They're kind of hard to see. Then this area here, they ran that log across it and walled it in and put a door in here. This window became a door, this door became a window, and this section of the house was taken out. This capilla part was taken out, and they added a zaguan or an entrance into the courtyard. And then this door is shown in this photograph, the contemporary photograph. Let's go back to that contemporary photograph. Okay, here you can see where they started to build upwards. Jerry and Ann Milord had bought the house And they were turning it into some kind of restaurant. They had an idea about it being an old castle and stuff like that. And this idea seemed to have been passed on. Now let's go on to the next photograph. Okay, this is what it looks like now. This is what they call the Martinez Hacienda. You can see right in here, that's where the window was. Here was where the entrance was. This door's a new door. And all the rest has been walled over except this door here, which is where the chapel was, where the capilla was. Everybody following me so far? Okay. Okay, historic preservation on the house began in 1972. Exterior windows and doors were walled in. The height of this once great rancho was nearly doubled. Large canales protruded from the walls. The southeast corner was now supported with a buttress to help contain the weight. Loopholes were made to shoot from. In case the Indians were attacking, you could shoot bows and arrows at them.
Microphone.
Flip the mic.
Oh, sorry about that, folks. Let me go back a little bit. Okay, the house was walled in, as you can see. They added canales to it. They added loopholes to it. It was completely encased, where once it was an open house. And they called it a hacienda. They call it a hacienda now. But the Martinez family always referred to it as El Rancho or La Casa en Ranchitos. Okay? 11 years later, with public and private funds, the Kit Carson Foundation of Taos opened the old house as a museum. What was once a home now became a fort, known to the world as La Hacienda de los Martinez. The building was supposed to be a refuge where endangered members of the community could find safety from the marauding and murderous Indians. Now the Martinez family could survive a long siege in their self-contained little city. The back-walled courtyard housed a weaving room, an area for blacksmiths, and the servants' quarters. Let's go to that next image, that one. Okay, this is the floor plan of what the house looks like now. And I have to tell you this, I really don't think any of it's authentic. I think the only authentic part of this house is probably that room right there. Okay? The rest of it, it just doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't conform with the old Randall photograph. Okay. Okay, now, one thing that I thought was very interesting, and it's something that I can talk about, is the servants' quarters. Now, here at the Hacienda, the servants were relegated back to probably the crummiest place of the so-called Hacienda. And those would have been very cold and very isolated rooms. That probably wasn't true at all. They probably had bedrooms of their own and perhaps would live and sleep in the kitchen. Now, servants were usually captive Indians, usually children. Slavery in the Spanish frontier was nothing like the slave trade in the rest of the world. One example is the story of Pablo, who was taken captive as a child by the Comanches. The Comanches always get a bad rap. I don't know how true this is about it always being the Comanches, but the story of the family goes the Comanches. Let's go to the next photograph. One day, out on patrol from Fort Union, Captain Simpson and his Taos volunteers encounter a band of Comanches selling captive children. The Emancipation Proclamation had just gone into effect, outlawing slavery. At first, Captain Simpson and the men refused to buy the children. But the Comanches said, "You either buy them or we kill them." Pablo came to Taos and became a member of the family. Pablo never married and helped raise 3 generations of my family. Let's go to the next photograph. Here is a photograph of my grandmother, here, Harriet Randall Spees, my great-grandmother, Estella Simpson Randall, and my great-grandmother's first cousin, Juanita Gonzalez. And here is Pablo knitting. And she lived to take care of 3 generations of my family, including my mother. She never married, but was always accepted as a member of the family. And the same was true with Severino Martinez's captives or servants. They were treated as members of the family. They were baptized, married. Severino's servants are reported to have been married in the will, and they were included in the will. They actually got property. Now, I went to work. Let's go to the next photograph. I went to work here at the Martinez Hacienda in 1983. My job was to keep the hacienda tidy and guide tourists through the museum, explaining how Severino fought Indians and held wild parties with fur traders of the mountain. For example, I was to tell tourists that the reason the front door entrances and doorways were so small was so that Severino and his family could clobber raiding Indians over the head when they bent over to enter the hacienda.
They still tell that story.
They still tell that
Sometimes.
story. Yeah, I believe it. I was also told to tell people that cannon could be positioned on the roofs and shot through the loopholes. It was all a crock of bullshit. And I said, here is the loopholes. I put this guy in here because he doesn't look like he'd be too harmful, but he had a hard time fitting through the door. He doesn't look like he's a marauding Indian anyway, but I thought it'd be funny to put him in there. Well, they wouldn't let me photograph the inside of the house. I want to tell you that the inside of the house of the Martinez Hacienda has these big, expansive rooms. And the problem with that is that the Martinez family would not have survived the winter. Those big rooms are hard to heat. Nowadays, we've got radiant heating, wood stoves and stuff like that. But in those days, they didn't. Fire pits were placed found all over the house. In other words, you go into one of these small rooms, which was 2 vadas by 3 vadas, 2 vadas wide by 3 vadas long, and you'd find a fire pit in this corner, a fire pit in this corner. They positioned them wherever they needed them. Sometimes in these rooms they would build boncos. Maybe somebody could sleep on a bonco. You'd go into these rooms very sparsely decorated. You'd find a mattress rolled up against the corner or on the floor or something like that. They really didn't have a great deal of material possessions, the original Martinez family. Okay, let's see where we're at now. Okay, prior to working at the Martinez Hacienda, I studied New Mexico history at UNM. I had done a pretty thorough literature review of New Mexico, plus I had looked at many, many old photographs of Taos. I had a pretty good understanding of what was going on. For example, I could never find any documentation to support that there were Indian raids in either Abiquiu or Taos. Conversations with my mentor, Dr. Myra Ellen Jenkins, confirmed that. She said there were no documentation to support anything but peace, and certainly no documentation to support a massive structure like this. One of the questions that we started to address, and maybe something we should think about today, and that is, does violence, whether it's real or imagined, sell tourism? I mean, do more people come here to gawk at Billy the Kid and all of these things? I mean, is this what brings people to New Mexico? Stories about marauding Indians, things like that. I mean, is that what people want to see? I don't really think so, but anyway, La Hacienda de los Martinez has been operating as a tourist museum for 30 years. Very little of the building and its contents could be recognized by Severino if he were alive today. To further support their ludicrous claims, in 1996, the Kit Carson Foundation and the Museum of New Mexico Press published On the Edge of Empire, the Taos Hacienda of Los Martinez. This is the book that they published. Many of you may have seen it. Okay. This I thought was a real travesty. I had read David Weber with great enthusiasm. He was the author. He was hired to do the book. At one time, a very well-respected scholar. He was dying of cancer and needed the money. Now I think that his past scholarship and credibility has been compromised. You know, what else did he do that was, you know, made up, was fictional? Okay, as time passes, more and more people pass through the Hacienda, believing it to be true. Even members of the Martinez family and the other old families of Taos think that Taos was once a violent place in need of such a fort. Let's go on to the next photograph. No, not that one, that. Okay, here's where it shows the expanse of the house, and the hills in the background match up with the old Randall photograph. Surprisingly, this is something that I really thought to be very unusual, very curious, no scholars have come forward to denounce the Martinez Hacienda. In conclusion, I can only say shame on us. This very bad and undisciplined history projects many bad messages, such as generations going to believe that warfare, Indian raids, and killing were a constant in the Taos Valley, and that history in Taos and New Mexico is fantasy. The worst of all, and I always get in trouble for saying this, but I don't care. Worst of all, we have created and allowed to thrive a monument to Anglo arrogance and dominance and to Hispano ignorance and apathy. This beautiful house and its history needs to be restored correctly. Any questions?
Yes?
Well, I have a lot of questions, but I'll start with just one. I'm curious, it's a little unclear to me when the ownership of the house changed. It sounded to me as though you were saying that it was altered substantially in the 60s, 1960s. At what point did your family sell the house, and to whom did they sell it, and who did the alterations in the 60s?
Okay, my family didn't own the house. My family were related to the Martinez's. And it went through many changes. I think a lot of the dates associated with some of the renovation of the house are wrong. But apparently after World War I or World War II, members of the family, Martinez family, ran into some money, and they put in courtyards, or they put in portals and stuff like that in the front of the building and in the inside of the building. That didn't work. I mean, the roof, it gave the roof a lot of problems. Then Jerry and Ann Malord bought the house in the late 60s and started to expand it upwards, wanting to build a restaurant. And then lots of little changes. You know, an artist named Schaefer had the house in the 40s. He made some additional renovations to it. So there have been a lot of changes. You know, does that answer that?
Yes, thank you.
Anything else?
Oh, I'll let somebody else.
Okay. Yes?
I understand why the rooms were built small.
Uh-huh.
Why were they always like built in a line?
Well, probably because it was easy. You know, you're building with basically rectangular blocks, and it was probably just easier. You know, you had corners and stuff to put in fireplaces and so on. That's the only reason I can think of. Yes, sir.
I have a question. Those small rooms with fire pits, how did you get rid of the smoke?
That was a big problem. You know, you would think that at about this level, there was probably a layer of smoke going throughout the building. Now, all the rooms were interconnected, so at certain times they could probably open up the doors and create a natural draft. A lot of times what they would do is cut a hole in the roof, you know, just a small hole, and the smoke would go up through the hole. Now, some of the rooms, like Severino's office, had a fireplace and a chimney. And then room number 14 on your guide also had a fireplace and a chimney. And that's seen in the old Randall photograph. You know, but I'm sure smoke was a problem. So neat. All right. Yes?
You mentioned that they didn't have canales for draining the water off the roof, and that when it snowed, they would go up and throw the snow off in some
Right.
fashion. What did they do actually in a rain? Did they just take buckets and bail it off, or?
Well, no. What would happen is it would rain. Remember, we're going through at least a vada of dirt, a lot of dirt. It would rain and it would evaporate.
Okay.
You know, and these people did a good job of maintaining their roofs. You know, so, and if the roof went, then the whole house would go. So there was a question back here.
In your photograph where you showed the big guy in the doorway,
Yeah.
can you go back to that
You
one?
want to go back to that one? Sure.
Can you go back to
Can
the
we go
one?
back to? Yeah.
So, yeah.
Not that one. No.
One
No.
you
Which
had.
way is
You
that?
have this one.
No, the other way.
Other way.
There we go.
Yeah. what
So
about-
you could see the old bigas there?
Well, no, those were canales. That
No,
was-
no, in the wall.
Plastered over.
Yeah. Plastered over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose you can.
So do you think that was, that would have been the original heights building?
It might have been, you
The bark.
know, the roof was changed so many times, the ceiling was changed a lot. But the ceiling would measure 4 vadas from the ground to the top of the ceiling. You see, what was so beautiful about this house was that it was all proportional, you know. And I don't really think that Don Severino built the house. I think he had a professional from Spain, perhaps, from Mexico, you know, that came in and did it. Because if you study the old photograph, you can see that this is a beautiful house. It was well made. Any other questions?
But are those bigas still there, like we see them
Oh,
in this photograph?
I-
Or they're just cut off?
Well, yeah, see what they do, is what the Spanish would do is that they would cut them off and plaster over them. And so the vigas were never left
But they're, so
exposed.
they're not there anymore on the other side? I mean, across the, in the rooms, they've been cut off and the ceiling's been raised?
Probably, yeah, in a lot of the rooms. I don't think the ceilings are authentic at all in any of the rooms. I mean, the ceiling would have been this high. So, yes. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious about the story today. You said that in 1983, it became the museum, and then the story was reshaped to help tourists. Is that still going on? Is that the same?
And as far as I know it is, I was up there in September, and I asked if there was any kind of history or any kind of, anything like that available in the house other than Weber's book, and the woman told me that there wasn't. And they had still mentioned things about, you know, Indian depredations and so on.
So who runs it?
Well, right now it's run by the Taos Museum, Taos
City.
Museum, whatever they are.
The city.
I can't
It's
find
a
it.
travesty.
It is a travesty.
It's not the city.
And it's a travesty that it's still going on, that they're still promoting it. And it's a travesty that we let them,
Yeah.
you know. But who knows, I mean, it could end up, the whole history of the Taos Valley could be completely rewritten fictitiously. Any other questions? Yes?
Well, about the roof, going back to the roof,
Uh-huh.
why weren't there any canales? Why wasn't that an obvious thing to do?
Canales, and are we talking about the house or the hacienda?
The house,
Well, because
the
they
original
didn't-
house.
Yeah, they didn't need them, because they would allow the roof would just dry out on its own, you know. I think that it would have done a lot of damage to the roof if you would have allowed water to pool there and tried to drain it off of the canal. And then there might be another reason too, is that, I guess you could add and cut a canale out, but they just weren't practical. And you look at all these old colonial dwellings, and none of them had canales. They all had packed roofs. Yes, sir.
Were there parapets around the edge of the roof?
Well, an architect named Bainbridge Bunting, who really didn't know what he was talking about, said that there was a parapet on the interior courtyard where people could climb up to the roof to shoot at Indians. You see, this whole myth about the violence in Taos Valley just didn't exist. They were making it up as they go along. They couldn't explain why this house existed. You see, they couldn't explain why a lot of other houses existed. You know, they were built to maximize energy, heat.
The top of the wall was level with the roof, the top of the roof,
The top of the wall was level, well,
with no parapet.
with no parapets, right. Never no portals or anything like that until later years. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, you mentioned that the adobes that were made in colonial times were better than the adobes made today, and I'm wondering, aside from their being handmade as distinguished from being put into a form, what would have made them so much better?
I don't know, maybe just the tamping and padding, you know, just compacting them like that. I had an old timer tell me one time that an old adobe you could take and throw and it would bounce, and some of these new adobes made from molds would crack and shatter.
It seems like something we've.
Well, you know, and they had people that specialized in doing this kind of stuff. It doesn't sound like a fun job to me, but.
Probably the ones in molds were made with wet or mud.
Excuse me?
The ones in molds are probably made with wet or mud.
Yeah, probably so.
So not packed, more brittle.
Yeah, probably so. Yes, ma'am.
To whom have you spoken about some of the differences of opinion that you have up there in Taos, and what was their reaction?
Well, their reaction was that it's not the house, that it's a different house. You know,
Well,
I mean, they're not going to sit back and say, oh gee, we made a mistake, and here we've blown $500,000 or more of public money.
Mhm.
You know, but, you know, they're wrong. And that's just all I have to say about it. Yes, sir.
If they made the rooms larger, then they had to move the interior walls.
Right.
The walls into toward the courtyard.
Right,
So none of those interior walls are original.
right. Right.
Going back to the lady's comment or question about the rooms being all in a row,
Uh-huh.